On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent on the Western Front. Germany had signed the armistice in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, not on a battlefield, not in a capital that has been taken, on a train. That image, that apparently minor detail, would poison German politics during the following years. Surrender without occupation created a gap between military reality and the political narrative that extremist groups would exploit with devastating consequences. The German army had not been destroyed on the battlefield. It had returned home in formation with its flags relatively intact. That was enough for the legend to germinate. On June 28, 1919, in the same Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles, where Bismarck had proclaimed the German Empire in 1871, the representatives of the new German government signed the peace treaty. Each clause was a deliberate wound. Article 231 declared Germany and its allies guilty of all damage caused by the war, the so-called War Guilt Clause. On this legal basis, the reparations building was built. The conditions were crushing. The German army would be limited to 100,000 troops. The navy would be reduced to a symbolic waste. 6 second-rate battleships, 6 light cruisers, 12 destroyers, and no submarines. Military aviation was prohibited. The Rhineland, the industrial heart of Western Germany, would be occupied by French and Belgian troops. The Saarland, the coal mining region, would pass under the administration of the League of Nations for 15 years. Poland would receive parts of former Prussia, separating East Prussia from the rest of the Reich through the so-called Polish Corridor. The free city of Danzig would come under international administration. And then there were the repairs. The final figure, fixed in 1921 by the Reparations Commission, amounted to 132,000 million gold marks, divided into 3 series of bonds. The Series A of 12,000 million was immediately due. The $38 billion Series B was dependent on Germany's ability to pay. The $82 billion Series C was conceived by economists such as John Maynard Keynes as essentially propagandistic, designed to satisfy the Allied public with no intention of being charged. The total number served to humiliate, not to collect. Keynes, who had participated in the British delegation in Paris and resigned in protest, published in December 1919 his work The Economic Consequences of Peace, warning that the conditions of Versailles would push Germany into economic and political chaos. It was ignored by the Allied governments. The following years would prove him right. The immediate problem was that the new Weimar Republic, proclaimed on November 9, 1918, under chaotic circumstances, inherited not only debts but also hatred. The Social Democrat Philipp Scheidemann proclaimed the Republic from a window of the Reichstag without anyone having asked him to do so, improvising in front of a crowd approaching the palace. The Kaiser had fled to the Netherlands. The new government, born under the crossfire of the Bolshevik Revolution and the coups of the ultra-right, he would have to sign the peace that the army did not want to admit. Friedrich Ebert, the first president of the Republic, a trained armchair and moderate politician, secretly negotiated with the army leadership an implicit alliance. The army would maintain order against left-wing revolutionaries, and the government would not question the internal structure of the armed forces. The Ebert-Groener Pact, named after General Wilhelm Groener, who represented the High Command, ensured the survival of the Republic in its first months, but at the price of leaving intact an institution that never accepted defeat. The country's industry had also been transformed. During the war, companies such as Krupp in Essen, Bayer and BASF in the Rhine region, Siemens and AEG in Berlin, had converted their industrial production to feed the war machine. Workers, accustomed to producing cannons, mortars and chlorine gas, would now have to make stoves and fertilizers. Or nothing, because demand had collapsed overnight. Between 1919 and 1922, the German economy survived in a state of perpetual crisis. The Weimar government, without sufficient industry and with a population hostile to taxes, resorted to the printing press. The Reich Bank began issuing marks with no real backing. It was the easiest solution and the most destructive. In January 1921, $1 bought approximately 75 German marks. By August 1923, the same operation required 4,620,455 marks. In November of that year, the parity was 4,200,000,000,000 marks per dollar. 4,200,000,000,000, a figure that did not fit in any conventional cash register. The German hyperinflation of 1923 was not a technical accident or a miscalculation by distracted officials. It was partly deliberate, partly inevitable, the consequence of a series of mutually reinforcing policy decisions. The breaking point came in January 1923, when Germany stopped paying for the agreed delivery of timber and telegraph poles as part of repairs. France and Belgium responded by militarily occupying the Ruhr, the country's industrial heartland, to extract the resources directly. The German government, headed by Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno, ordered a passive resistance. Ruhr workers were to refuse to work for the occupiers. The government would pay for them out of its own pocket. To do so, the Reichsbank printed money without limit. The passive resistance lasted 8 months and cost more than all the repairs paid up to that point. The effects on daily life were devastating in their immediacy. In Berlin, the price of a kilo of bread, which in 1914 cost 13 pfennigs, reached in November of 1923 the 428,000 million marks. Printers worked in 24-hour shifts. The bills were printed only on one side to speed up the process. Wheelbarrows, not purses, were used to carry the money needed for daily shopping. In some cases, employees received their salary twice a day to prevent it from losing value between morning and lunch. The rentiers, the small savers, the retirees with fixed pensions, the holders of government bonds, they all saw their life savings evaporate in weeks. A man who in 1914 had deposited 10,000 marks in the bank, a considerable sum enough to buy a modest house, received in 1924 the equivalent of less than a penny on the dollar. The German middle class, which had survived 4 years of war while retaining its financial assets, was economically destroyed in months of peace. Paradoxically, some came out winners. Big industrialists like Hugo Stinnes, the Ruhr tycoon who built one of Europe's largest industrial conglomerates during inflation, could pay off their debts with freshly printed marks, while their real assets, factories, mines, land, held their value. Farmers with land and production could exchange real goods for cash. Speculators who had contracted debts in marks before inflation and paid them with devalued currency enriched themselves at the expense of their creditors. The effect on the moral fabric of society was as profound as the economic one. Hyperinflation destroyed confidence in institutions more definitively than any military defeat. If the state was able to erase a life's savings by simply deciding to print paper, what guarantee could it offer its citizens? The contracts lost meaning. Life insurance became worthless paper. Mortgages that had taken decades to take out could be settled with the equivalent of a tip. The world of certainties and forecasts on which the middle class had built its life was reduced to rubble, and that deep resentment, that feeling of having been swindled by the state itself, would be an open wound that political agitators would know how to exploit with precision in the years to come. The crisis reached its turning point in August 1923. Chancellor Kuno was dismissed and replaced by Gustav Stresemann, who, in his brief 100 days at the head of the government, took the boldest measures of the Republic. He ended passive resistance in the Ruhr on September 26, 1923, facing the fury of the nationalists, and authorized the creation of a new currency. On November 15, 1923, the Rentenmark entered circulation. Designed by economist Karl Helfferich and executed by the new Reichsbank president, Hjalmar Schacht, the Rentenmark was not backed by gold because Germany did not have enough. It was nominally backed by the country's agricultural and industrial lands, a legal fiction, but a fiction that worked because people chose to believe it. The exchange rate was set at 1 trillion old marks for each Rentenmark. Overnight, the currency stabilized, inflation stopped, prices are normalized. Schacht iron-bound the amount of Rentenmarks in circulation, refusing to print more than the system could absorb. The complaints of the industrialists and the government were ignored. Monetary discipline was brutal and effective, but the damage was already done. The destruction of middle-class savings, the feeling of having been betrayed by the state, the visceral memory of carrying wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy bread. All this was etched in the German collective memory with an intensity that would mark the country's politics for decades. Meanwhile, in a Munich beer hall on November 8, 1923, an Austrian war veteran with a short moustache and a shrill voice was attempting a coup. Munich's Bürgerbräukeller was a typical Bavarian meeting room of the 1920s. Whitewashed walls, low ceilings, long wooden tables capable of accommodating several hundred people at a time. On November 8, 1923, the Bavarian State Commissar, Gustav von Kahr, was giving a speech to an audience of about 3,000 people. At 8:30 p.m., a group of armed men burst through the side doors. Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, formally founded in 1920 on the ashes of a small Munich workers' party, jumped on a table, fired a shot at the ceiling, and shouted that the national revolution had begun. The putsch was an absolute failure. General Erich Ludendorff, the military hero of the war whom Hitler had convinced to participate in the conspiracy, marched the next day together with the conspirators towards the center of Munich. In front of the Feldherrenhalle, the state police opened fire. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. The coup leaders fled or were arrested. Hitler was tried in February 1924 and sentenced to 5 years in prison, although he would be released before serving one. The trial was, however, an unexpected gift. National media coverage provided him with a platform that transformed a regional agitator into a national figure. During his 9 months of imprisonment in the fortress of Landsberg am Lech, Hitler dictated the basis of his political vision to his secretary Rudolf Hess. The result was Mein Kampf, published in 1925. The lesson Hitler drew from the failed putsch was strategic and cold. The road to power did not pass through the barracks, but through the ballot box. In the May 1928 election, the National Socialist Party won a mere 2.5% of the national vote and 12 seats in the 491-member Reichstag. They were irrelevant. So scarce was it the money of the party that in the autumn of that year they had to cancel their annual congress due to lack of funds. Meanwhile, the Weimar Republic was experiencing a period of relative stability thanks to the Dawes Plan. In August 1924, US diplomat Charles G. Dawes, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize that year, presented Germany with a game-changing plan. The Dawes Plan did not cancel the repairs, but it restructured them. It established a schedule of gradual payments that began at 1,000 million gold marks in the first year and progressively ascended. Most importantly, it was accompanied by an initial loan of 800 million marks in gold to restore the Reichsbank's reserves. The Dawes Plan was possible because the governments of France, Britain and the United States understood that a collapsing Germany was more dangerous than a manageable Germany. It wasn't philanthropy. It was geopolitical calculation, and it worked, at least for a while. Between 1924 and 1929, US loans to Germany amounted to 25.5 billion Reichsmarks. Money came from Wall Street, from banks like J.P. Morgan and Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and was invested in German industrial reconstruction. Factories modernized their equipment. Cities built social housing. The gross domestic product grew. Unemployment was falling. On the streets of Berlin, the cabarets were open until dawn, and a generation that had survived the war and hyperinflation tried to forget in jazz and expressionism. But there was a structural trap at the heart of the system. Germany paid reparations to France and Britain with money borrowed from the United States. France and Britain used that money to pay their own war debts to Washington. It was a circular financial circuit that only worked as long as US loans continued to flow. If the faucet was turned off, the circle was broken. Gustav Stresemann, who remained as Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1923 until his death in October 1929 at the age of only 51, patiently built a foreign policy of reconciliation. Bank saw its foreign exchange reserves plummet. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning, a centrist Catholic politician, took office in March 1930 and chose the path of deflation. It reduced public spending. He lowered the salaries of civil servants. He increased taxes. He cut unemployment benefits. It did so because the gold standard system and the commitments of the Young Plan left no alternative. If Germany did not maintain its exchange rate peg and pay its foreign debts, the financial collapse would be even worse. But deflation had an immediate and brutal human cost. Unemployment, which in 1929 affected 1.3 million people, reached 3 million in January 1930. By the winter of 1931 to 1932, it exceeded 6 million registered unemployed. Actual estimates, including part-time workers and those who had stopped looking for work, were as high as 8 to 9 million. In a population of 65 million people, it meant that almost a third of German families had a member who was totally unemployed. The consequences were felt in every aspect of daily life. In the working-class neighborhoods of Hamburg, Berlin or Essen, the family menu consisted of black bread and cabbage soup. Soup kitchens distributed food to queues that stretched several blocks apart. The men spent their mornings in the parks of the cities because they did not even have money for the tram. Women worked piecework, sewing or washing other people's clothes to get some pfennigs. The children went to school without breakfast. On the political level, the collapse was equally dramatic. In the September 1930 elections, the National Socialist Party went from 12 seats in 1928 to 107, becoming the second largest party in the Reichstag. The communism of the KPD also grew. The forces that supported the Republic were fragmented. Brüning ruled by emergency decrees under Article 48 of the Constitution because he did not have a parliamentary majority. He was applying democracy to dismantle it. In the summer of 1931, the German financial system collapsed for good. The bankruptcy of the Danat Bank on July 13, 1931, precipitated by well-founded rumors about its exposure to bad debts, triggered a general bank run. The government declared the temporary closure of all banks. When they reopened, they did so under a currency control regime. No German could withdraw more than 50 Reichsmarks per month for expenses abroad. The state had taken effective control of the financial system. In July 1932, the Nazi Party won 37.2% of the vote in the Reichstag elections, becoming the most voted party in Weimar history. But Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. In November 1932, in new elections, the Nazi Party lost 2 million votes. Its financing was at its limit. Its leaders were beginning to despair. And then, the conservative political machine made the biggest miscalculation of the 20th century. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, an 85-year-old field marshal, erected president since 1925 as a symbol of Imperial Germany, appointed Adolf Hitler Reich Chancellor. The Conservatives, former Chancellor Franz von Papen, media mogul Alfred Hugenberg, General Werner von Blomberg, believed they could control it, that it was a useful instrument to mobilize the masses while they managed the real power. Surrounding him with conservative ministers, they reasoned, would tame him. They couldn't have been more wrong. On February 20th, 1933, 3 weeks after his appointment, Hitler summoned some 25 of Germany's leading industrialists to a private meeting at the villa of Hermann Göring, who was acting as president of the Reichstag. Among the attendees were Georg von Schnitzler from E.G. Farben, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen, president of the Association of Reich Industrialists, and Albert Vögler, CEO of Vestag United Steel Mills, the world's second-largest steel company. Hitler spoke for almost an hour. He did not discuss economic policy. He did not present programs or projects. He spoke of the communist danger, of the weakness of democracy, of the need to crush the left before it destroyed the business class. Then he left the room. Göring stayed and got to the point. German business had a vital interest in the destruction of the workers' movement, that it should therefore make an adequate financial contribution. The election campaign on March 5th would be probably the last election of the next 100 years. Hjalmar Schacht, the president of the Reich Bank who had joined the Nazis, managed the contributions. I.G. Farben contributed 400,000 Reichsmarks. Deutsche Bank, 200,000. The Mining Association, an additional 400,000. In all, some 3 million Reichsmarks flowed into the party's coffers for what would effectively be the last free election campaign in Germany for 12 years. On February 27th, the Reichstag building burned, a fire whose authorship is still debated among historians, but whose political consequences were immediate and devastating. The next day, February 28, 1933, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Fire Decree, which suspended the fundamental civil liberties guaranteed by the Constitution: freedom of the press, of assembly, of association, inviolability of the home. It was, in practice, the end of the rule of law in Germany. The March 5th election gave the Nazi Party 43.9% of the vote. It was not the absolute majority that Hitler wanted, but with the support of Hugenberg's Nationalist Party, he reached the necessary majority to govern. On March 23rd, the Reichstag passed the Enabling Act, which gave the government full legislative powers for 4 years. Social Democratic MPs voted against it with their fists raised. The Communists had already been arrested or fled. The vote was approved by 444 to 94. Germany was no longer a democracy, and the economic recovery that the regime was preparing to execute would not be what the propaganda would proclaim. In January 1933, when Hitler took power, Germany officially registered 6,013,612 unemployed. By December 1935, the official figure had fallen to 2,150,000. Nazi propaganda presented this reduction as proof of the economic genius of the new regime. The reality was considerably more complex. Part of the reduction in unemployment was real, but part of it was accounting. The first mechanism of statistical manipulation consisted of excluding entire categories of workers from the official count. Women who left the labor market to marry did not count as unemployed, in part because the regime launched in 1933 the nuptial loan program, Ehestandsdarlehen. Couples who married could receive a loan of up to 1,000 Reichsmarks in vouchers for the purchase of household goods, on condition that the bride stopped working. Each such marriage artificially reduced unemployment statistics by one person, although in real economic terms it simply moved a worker from the labor market to the home. The second mechanism was to count as fully employed workers who actually worked part-time. The third consisted of classifying the inmates of the first concentration camps, which began to be built in March 1933, as de facto workers. The fourth was to exclude from the count the workers sent to the voluntary labor service, Freiwilligen Arbeitsdienst, which would later become the compulsory Reichsarbeitsdienst, young people who worked in very poor conditions for less than the unemployment benefits they had previously received, draining ditches and clearing land for state projects. However, it would be unfair to claim that the decline in unemployment was purely fictitious. The economist Albrecht Ritschl from the University of Humboldt has calculated that in 1933 private investment, especially in the construction and accumulation of inventories, was by far the largest single driver to recovery. The German economy was already showing signs of cyclical recovery in the last quarter of 1932 before Hitler came to power. In other words, economic activity had bottomed out and was beginning to rebound by its own mechanisms before the new regime took any action. What the Nazi government did was to mount on this wave of spontaneous recovery a program of massive public spending oriented, from the beginning, towards a very specific objective: rearmament. The first fiscal stimulus package was the Reinhardt program, presented in June 1933 by the Secretary of State of the Ministry of Finance, Fritz Reinhardt. A total of about 1,000 million Reichsmarks would be allocated to public works, construction of roads, public buildings, rural sanitation, housing. It was a genuine measure of job creation. The number of people working on public works programs grew from 289,000 in February 1933 to 1,075,000 in March 1934, an increase of nearly 800,000 direct positions. Yet even at their peak, these programs accounted for only 30% of the reduction in registered unemployment. The rest were due to other causes. The key decision came on December 6, 1933, when government offices in Berlin made a formal, secret resolution. There would be no more new money for civilian job creation. The Reinhardt Fund was fully committed, and projects already authorized would be terminated, but not expanded. From that moment on, the exclusive priority was rearmament. In April 1934, the secret mechanism for financing rearmament was set in motion with full power. Military spending in 1934 amounted to at least 4,000 million Reichsmarks, of which less than half appeared in the official Reich budget. That meant that by the second year of Hitler's rule, military spending already accounted for more than 50% of the central government's total spending on goods and services. By 1935, that proportion would rise to 73%. The obvious question is, how did the government finance this spending without triggering hyperinflation again? The answer was called Mefo-Wechsel, and it was one of the most audacious and most dangerous financial instruments in modern economic history. Hjalmar Schacht returned to the presidency of the Reich Bank in March 1933. He was 55 years old, had a formidable international reputation, and had the will to run the German economy at any cost. He was not a Nazi by ideological conviction. He was a pragmatist who had decided that the Nazi regime was the most effective vehicle for achieving the goals he considered necessary to achieve the goals he considered necessary to achieve the goals he had achieved. Germany, rearmament, the repudiation of reparations, and the recovery of national greatness. The problem Schacht faced was mathematically simple. Germany had no money to rearm. It had no gold reserves. He could not borrow on international markets without revealing his military intentions and violating the Treaty of Versailles. He couldn't raise taxes without destroying the economic recovery. And it could not print money without the risk of new hyperinflation, which was the collective nightmare of German society. Schacht's solution was to create a fictitious company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, MBH, Metallurgical Research Society, Limited, in whose acronym was the key, MEFO. This company, capitalized with barely 1 million Reichsmarks contributed by 4 large arms companies, Krupp, Siemens, Gute Hoffnungshütte, and Rheinmetall, did not do any real metallurgical research. It existed only to issue promissory notes. The mechanism worked like this. When the government ordered armaments from a company, it received a Mefo-Wechsel, a promissory note issued by Mefo GmbH, as payment instead of cash. The company could hold the promissory note until maturity, or it could discount it at any commercial bank, which in turn could discount it at the Reich Bank. Promissory notes matured in 3 months, but could be renewed for up to 5 years. They earned 4% interest. The result was that the government could contract huge quantities of armaments without the expense appearing in the official budget. The Mefo-Wechsels were not official government bonds, they were not sold on the public markets, and their existence was a state secret. Industrialists who received them as payment had no incentive to disclose them. The notes bore interest and could be converted to cash when necessary. Between 1934 and 1938, the German government issued Mefo-Wechsel for a total value of approximately 12,000 million Reichsmarks. This sum financed the rebuilding of the Luftwaffe from scratch, the expansion of the army, accelerated shipbuilding, and the production of war materials on a scale that no foreign power fully suspected. The American economist Burton Klein calculated decades later that total spending on German rearmament between 1933 and 1939 exceeded 90,000 million Reichsmarks, a figure that would have been impossible without such creative financial instruments as the Mefo-Wechsel. But the Mefo-Wechsels had an expiration date. In 1939, when most of the promissory notes issued in the early years began to mature simultaneously, Schacht warned Hitler that the system was approaching collapse. If all Mefo-Wechsel holders presented them for collection at the same time, the Reich Bank would be forced to print money en masse, triggering inflation. In January 1939, Hitler removed Schacht as president of the Reich Bank. By then, the war was planned for that same year. The collapse of the financial house of cards would be solved by conquest. The Treaty of Versailles forbade Germany from having military aviation, tanks, submarines, and a host of other offensive weapons. The Reich could have an army of 100,000 men equipped with light weapons. Nothing more. The systematic violation of these restrictions began before Hitler. As early as the 1920s, the Reichswehr had established secret training schools in the Soviet Union, taking advantage of the 1922 Treaty of Versailles that normalized relations between the two pariah countries in international politics. In the fields of Lipetsk, German pilots practiced with Soviet aircraft. At Kazan, German armor was trained with the doctrine that would later be called Blitzkrieg. In Volsk, military engineers experimented with combat gases. But it was under Hitler that remilitarization went from being clandestine to being systematic and massive, although still covered with a layer of dissimulation that became increasingly transparent. The factories of the Heinkel Company, based in Rostock, officially produced passenger aircraft, light biplanes, mail monoplanes. The He-51, the first German-produced fighter in the new era, was publicly presented in 1932 as an aerobatic training aircraft. The He-111, which would become one of the Luftwaffe's main bombers, was offered to Lufthansa, the commercial airline, as a medium-speed airliner. It was such a blatant ploy that foreign military observers simply stopped bothering to believe the official explanations. The factories of the Düsseldorf-based company Rheinmetall produced agricultural tractors that were actually battle tanks without the turret superstructures. Krupp built 70-ton heavy tractors for the agricultural industry. Bayer and BASF engineers at IG Farben were working on industrial paints that were actually chemical warfare agents. The shipbuilding industry was also reorganized. Admiral Erich Raeder, appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Navy in 1928, had begun secret planning for the rebuilding of the fleet. In 1934, when naval expenditures began to visibly escalate in the official budget, the Navy justified the shipyards under construction in Kiel and Hamburg as maintenance and renovation of the ships permitted by the treaty. What was actually being built in those shipyards was a fleet of submarines, heavy cruisers, and eventually the battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz. On March 16, 1935, Hitler finally took the step that was already an open secret. he publicly announced the re-establishment of conscription. The army, which according to Versailles could not exceed 100,000 men, would grow to 36 divisions, approximately 550,000 soldiers. By the end of 1935, the army reached 800,000 troops, 8 times the maximum allowed by the treaty. The international reaction was one of verbal dismay and practical passivity. France protested in the League of Nations. Britain signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June 1935, which in practice recognized Germany's right to build a navy equal to 35% of the Royal Navy's tonnage. It was, de facto, the tacit acceptance that the Treaty of Versailles was dead. By then, Germany's last unemployed non-Jewish male had been absorbed into the armed forces. On September 23, 1933, in a town called Unterhaching, south of Munich, Adolf Hitler took a shovel and symbolically overturned the first cartload of earth of the most ambitious public infrastructure project of the Weimar Republic that the new regime appropriated, the Reich Highway Network, better known as the Autobahn. The moment was carefully staged. Joseph Goebbels' ministry propaganda distributed precise instructions for local events in each region. Schools suspended classes so that children could listen to the radio broadcast. Workers in factories, offices and farms had an official break to listen to the Führer. The slogan was that the great national work had begun. The Inspector General of German Roads, Fritz Todt, an engineer trained at the Technical University of Munich who had joined the Nazi Party in 1922, had an ambitious project to connect the main German cities by a network of modern highways with separate dual carriageways, with gentle curves, moderate slopes and a width of 24 meters of road. The estimated initial cost was 3,000 million Reichsmarks. Official propaganda presented the Autobahn as the symbol of the German Renaissance, a system of modern roads that would connect all citizens and allow them to discover the beauty of their homeland at the wheel of the new people's car. Hitler personally designed some of the layouts, choosing routes that traverse the most picturesque landscapes to create the impression of a modern, aesthetically conscious state. But behind the myth was a more complicated reality. First, the Autobahn did not create as much employment as the propaganda claimed. The maximum number of workers employed simultaneously across the network was 125,000 in 1936. For an economy with millions of unemployed, it was a modest contribution. By comparison, the railroads employed more than 500,000 people. Housing and public building construction programs generated more employment than the Autobahn at a lower cost. Second, and this was the most telling irony of the difference between propaganda and reality, the highways had no immediate military utility. Hitler had imagined that panzers would roll through them quickly and easily. That vision had several serious technical problems. The asphalt of the Autobahns, designed for passenger cars weighing between 1,000 and 1,500 kilograms, could not support the weight of a 23-ton Panzer IV without serious damage. The Wehrmacht had to move its armoured divisions mainly by rail, with the tanks transported on railway platforms. Nazi highways in their early years were in practice unusable for armoured formations. The third problem was even more basic: who was going to use them? By 1939, with several thousand kilometres already completed, traffic levels on the Autobahn were disappointing. The railway remained by far the dominant means of transport in Germany. The reason was simple: the average German didn't have a car. In August 1936, Hitler drafted a secret memorandum that was intended for only two people: General Werner von Blomberg, Minister of Defense, and Hermann Göring, who would be appointed plenipotentiary of the four-year plan. The document was explicit in its terms. Germany's solution can only be achieved by force, with the corresponding acceptance of the risks. The German army must be ready for war within 4 years. The German economy must be ready for war within 4 years. The four-year plan, publicly announced at the Party Congress in Nuremberg on September 9, 1936, had as its main objectives economic autarky, independence from foreign imports, and the maximization of the production of strategic raw materials. Two problems obsessed German military strategists: rubber and oil. Germany had no significant oil deposits in its metropolitan territory. In 1936, it imported 3.8 million tons of oil a year, a significant portion of which came from wells in the Western Hemisphere. In the event of war, a British naval blockade, similar to the one that had contributed to German starvation between 1916 and 1918, could deprive the Wehrmacht of fuel in a matter of months. The solution that the four-year plan prioritized was the hydrogenation of coal to produce synthetic fuel, a technology that IG Farben had developed at its plant in Luna, Saxony, since the late 1920s. The process was expensive. Producing synthetic oil from coal cost about 4 times as much as importing crude oil. But it was oil that could be produced on German soil regardless of imports. Göring signed contracts with IG Farben that guaranteed the chemical consortium a price of 23 pfennigs per litre of synthetic fuel, regardless of the world market price, which in those years was 5 pfennigs per litre. It was an astronomical subsidy, justified by the logic of national security. Between 1936 and 1939, IG Farben built or expanded 6 hydrogenation plants, with a total capacity reaching 1 million tons per year of synthetic fuel by 1940. Rubber was the second strategic problem. Germany imported almost all of its rubber from plantations in the region of Malaysia and Indonesia, controlled by the British and Dutch colonial empires. In the event of war with Great Britain, the supply would be interrupted. IG Farben had developed since the 1930s a process to produce synthetic rubber from acetylene and butadiene derived from coal. The product was called Buna, short for butadiene natrium. In 1935, IG built the first Buna plant in Schkopau, also in Saxony. By 1939, the four-year plan had invested some 10,000 million Reichsmarks in industrial plants of strategic raw materials: synthetic fuels, synthetic rubber, aluminum, special steel, explosives. It was a program of public investment in basic industry unprecedented in peacetime economic history. But the results were below targets. Synthetic rubber production in 1939 was about 22,000 tons, compared to consumption of 120,000 tons per year. The production of synthetic fuel covered just over half of military needs. The complete autarky that Göring had promised in 1936 was a technical and economic impossibility. Germany remained dramatically dependent on foreign imports of essential raw materials, and this meant that in order to survive in war, he would have to get them through conquest. While Schacht built the financial scaffolding of rearmament and Göring oversaw accelerated industrialization, Hitler consolidated political control of the state through violence. On June 30th, 1934, known in history as the Night of the Long Knives, the SS executed the leaders of the SA, the assault sections, the brown shirts, who had been the party's instrument of street violence during his ascension, along with a host of actual or potential political adversaries. Ernst Röhm, head of the SA and a personal friend of Hitler's since the early years of the party, was arrested at the resort of Bad Wiessee, Bavaria, at 6 o'clock in the morning on June 30th, and executed 2 days later in Stadelheim prison. The confirmed death toll in the purge was 85 people. The most careful historical estimates point to a figure that could have reached 200. Among those executed was General Kurt von Schleicher, the last Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, who was assassinated along with his wife in their Berlin home. Gregor Strasser, the party organizer who had tried to negotiate with Schleicher in December 1932 and had been expelled from the party, also died. Former Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen, from whose hands Hitler had received the position of Chancellor, survived because the diplomatic embarrassment of assassinating a sitting member of the government was too great. His closest aides were shot. The significance of the Night of the Long Knives was not simply the physical elimination of rivals. It was the public establishment that the Nazi state operated outside of any legal norm. The government had murdered its own citizens, including army officers, without any legal process. Hitler acknowledged the fact in a speech to the Reichstag on July 13, 1934, without any euphemism. Those executed were traitors, and he had acted as supreme judge of the German people. President Hindenburg sent a congratulatory telegram. On August 2, 1934, Hindenburg died. In the hours that followed, before the official announcement of the death, the government enacted a law merging the offices of President and Chancellor into the new figure of the Führer and Chancellor of the Reich. All members of the armed forces took a personal oath of allegiance to Adolf Hitler, not to the Constitution or the German state. It was a change of enormous consequence. The army no longer served Germany, it served man. In the plebiscite called on August 19, 1934 to ratify the merger of positions, 89.9% of voters approved the measure. In the repression that preceded it, and with the terror of the Gestapo already installed in daily life, the figures of participation and approval were difficult to interpret. But it was also true that a significant part of German society, exhausted by years of crisis and instability, saw the end of parliamentary chaos with relief. Order had a price that many were willing, or felt obliged, to pay. On September 15, 1935, at the Party Congress in Nuremberg, Hitler announced the laws that would bear the name of that city, the Reich Citizenship Law, which divided the country's inhabitants into citizens of the Reich, with full political rights, and subjects of the state without them, and the law for the protection of German blood and honor, which prohibited marriage and sexual relations between Jews and non-Jews. The Nuremberg laws were not simply ideology. They had direct and deliberate economic consequences. The legal definition of Jew established by the laws, anyone with 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents regardless of their current religion, or with 2 Jewish grandparents in certain circumstances, allowed for the systematic exclusion of those affected from the labor market, from regulated professions, and from business ownership. The process of Aryanization, Arisierung, of Jewish-owned enterprises intensified from 1935 to 1936. The mechanism was simple in its brutality. Jewish owners faced increasing pressure from local authorities, party-controlled employers' unions, customers who stopped buying, and suppliers who stopped supplying. Eventually, they sold, at prices well below the real market value, to Aryan buyers, often linked to the party. The state did not pay any compensation. The profit from the transaction went entirely to the buyer and indirectly to the party. The scale of the expropriation was enormous. In 1933, there were approximately 100,000 Jewish-owned or Jewish-owned enterprises in Germany, representing a disproportionate share of the wholesale trade, banking, insurance, textile and leather industries, and the liberal professions. By 1939, the vast majority of these companies had been Aryanized, liquidated, or transferred to Aryan owners. From the regime's perspective, this served a dual function. Ideologically, he purified the economy along racial lines. Economically, it created a class of small and medium-sized entrepreneurs fully dependent on the regime that had enriched them, generating a loyal support base. The displacement of Jews from the labor market also created positions that could be filled by unemployed Aryans. However, the long-term consequences of racial policy for the German economy were devastating, even if they were not appreciated in the short term. The systematic expulsion of Jewish citizens from academic and scientific life, some 2,000 university professors lost their positions between 1933 and 1935, including 12 current or future Nobel laureates, such as Albert Einstein, deprived German science of some of its brightest minds. Many emigrated to Britain and the United States, where they would contribute to the Allied atomic program that Germany was never able to develop. On May 2, 1933, just 3 months after coming to power, the brown shirts of the SA and the steel helmets of the SS simultaneously took over all the headquarters of the German trade unions throughout the country. Union funds, properties, publications, archives were confiscated. The union leaders were arrested, The most prominent were sent to concentration camps. The strongest organized labor movement in Europe, which had existed for more than 70 years and had millions of members, disappeared in a single day. Instead, the regime created the German Labour Front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, DAF, led by Dr. Robert Ley, a drunken chemist with a reputation for intellectual neglect and organizational efficiency. The DAF was not a union. It did not negotiate wages or working conditions. This function was directly absorbed by the state through the so-called labor syndics, Treuhänder der Arbeit, appointed by the government. The DAF was rather an organization of social control and labor propaganda, whose aim was to integrate the workers into the Führer's national community and maintain productivity through ideological mobilization. The National Labour Organization Law of January 20, 1934, established the structure of the Nazi enterprise. The entrepreneur was the Führer of the enterprise, Betriebsführer, with undisputed authority. The workers were his followers, Gefolgschaft, who owed obedience and loyalty. Labor disputes were incompatible with the national harmony that the regime proclaimed. Nominal wages in 1933 were already well below 1929 levels due to the cuts imposed during the Brüning deflation. The regime froze these wages and kept them frozen for years, even when economic recovery and full employment would have generated upward pressures. This freeze was one of the fundamental mechanisms by which rearmament was financed internally. While prices rose moderately and wages remained flat, the gap between the two became forced savings that the state could channel into armaments. To compensate for material austerity, the regime offered symbolic and recreational substitutes. The organization Kraft durch Freude, Force for Joy, KDF, was the section of the DAF in charge of workers' free time. He organized holiday cruises in the Norwegian fjords and the Canary Islands on ships such as the Wilhelm Gustloff or the Robert Ley, which could carry up to 1,500 passengers. He organized cultural excursions, trips to the opera house, swimming lessons, dance courses. By 1938, the KDF was the largest tourist agency in Germany, if not the world. For the average worker who had never left his home province, the prospect of a cruise to the Mediterranean, even if it was on a ship full of co-workers guarded by party officials, was an astonishing novelty. And it was also a control mechanism. The worker who could go from holidays thanks to the regime had less reason to complain about frozen wages. In the summer and fall of 1934, the Nazi regime came closer to economic collapse than any official propaganda would ever admit. Accelerated rearmament since early 1934 had generated massive demand for imports, non-ferrous metals such as copper, lead, nickel and manganese that Germany lacked, oil, rubber, textile fibers. The Mefo-Wechsels could finance domestic spending, but they could not create foreign currency out of thin air. The Reichsbank's foreign exchange reserves were falling at an alarming rate. In the spring of 1934, the Reichsbank had equivalent reserves to cover barely 2 weeks of imports. Germans traveling abroad were limited to an equivalent of 50 Reichsmarks per month. Companies that needed imported raw materials had to demonstrate their essentiality to the national effort in the face of a bureaucracy of currency control that grew week by week. Schacht responded in August 1934 with the new plan, Neuer Plan, a system of total currency control that subjected all German imports to prior authorization. 25 exchange supervisors, Überwachungsstellen, per industry sector handled the applications. Countries exporting to Germany were pressured to accept bilateral compensation agreements. Each mark of German exports to their market had to be matched by imports from that country into Germany. It was the end of multilateral trade. The clearing system, Clearingverkehr, with the Balkan countries, Romania, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Hungary, was particularly sophisticated. Germany imported wheat, oil, raw materials from these countries and in exchange exported machinery, railway material and industrial goods. Payments were made into clearing accounts in Berlin that recipient countries could only use to buy German exports. It was a barter system disguised as trade, and had the effect of structurally linking the economy of Central and Eastern Europe to that of Germany. Tension between Schacht, who was trying to maintain some financial discipline, and Göring, who wanted to spend without limits on rearmament, erupted in 1936. Schacht warned that the economy was overheated, that the pent-up inflation accumulated behind price controls would become uncontrollable, that the government's debt was already unpayable without a military victory to provide booty. Göring replied that Schacht was a short-sighted coward. Hitler settled the debate in September 1936 by appointing Göring plenipotentiary of the 4-year plan with powers over the entire economy. Schacht nominally remained as Minister of Economy until November 1937, when he was appointed Minister of Economics. Relieved. In January 1939, he was finally removed from the presidency of the Reichsbank after presenting a petition signed by the entire board warning of the inflationary danger. Hitler read it, wrote it down angrily, and the signatories were fired. By then, war was already a decision made. On September 1, 1939, when German columns crossed the Polish border before dawn, the Wehrmacht was a force that 6 years earlier did not exist in any army manual. The army, the Heer, had 98 deployable divisions, of which 6 were panzer divisions equipped with tanks and organized for mobile warfare. The most advanced tanks were the Panzer III with a 37mm gun and the Panzer IV with a 75mm gun, although in 1939 most German armor was the Panzer I and II training tanks with light armament. The employment doctrine, developed by military theorists such as General Heinz Guderian in his work Achtung, Panzer of 1937, envisaged the massive use of the armored formation penetrating deep into enemy lines, disorganizing command and supplies before infantry could consolidate. It would be called Blitzkrieg. But in September 1939, no one had yet tested it against a modern adversary. The Luftwaffe, which 6 years earlier was legally non-existent, had by September 1939 approximately 4,000 frontline aircraft. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, designed by Willy Messerschmitt and mass-produced since 1937, was one of the most advanced fighters in the world, with a top speed of 570 kilometers per hour and a service ceiling of 10,500 meters. The Junkers Ju 87 Stuka, with its dive-breaking and psychologically panicked attack siren, had been tested in combat during the Spanish Civil War, where Germany intervened in support of Francisco Franco with the Condor Legion beginning in November 1936. The Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was less developed than the other corps because Hitler had calculated that war with Britain would come later, giving time to build the large ocean fleet projected for 1948 to 1949. Admiral Erich Raeder bitterly acknowledged this in his diary upon learning of the British declaration of war. The German Navy in 1939 can only show that it knows how to die with honor. However, the 73 submarines that were operational at that time, added to those that would be built during the war, would become the most effective threat Germany posed to Britain's survival. In macroeconomic terms, the German gross national product had grown from approximately 60,000 million Reichsmarks in 1932 to more than 105,000 million in 1939. Spending on armaments accounted for about 23% of national income in 1939, the highest level of any economy in formal peacetime in modern history. German industry in 1939 produced more steel than Britain and France combined. And yet, the Wehrmacht economist, Major General Georg Thomas, in 1939 presented to members of the Foreign Office an analysis that was, under his own circumstances, terribly lucid. If the economic resources of Britain, France, Poland, the Soviet Union, and the United States were added together, Germany faced an aggregate disadvantage that only the speed and surprise of victory could compensate. German strength was real, but it was also fragile, dependent on quick victories that would break the cycle of import dependence before the financial system collapsed under its own weight. The image that the regime projected to the world, and that many abroad accepted without critical examination, was that of a perfectly planned and coordinated economy, a Swiss precision war machine in which every resource was optimized for the war effort. The reality was more akin to fierce competition between factions hoarding resources and boycotting each other. The historian Adam Tooze, in his monumental analysis, The Wages of Destruction, published in 2006, has documented in detail how the Nazi economy was in many respects chaotic. Multiple agencies with overlapping competencies fought for the same steel, the same coal, the same specialized labor. Göring and his 4-year plan competed with Schacht's Ministry of Economics, which competed with the ministries of the Army, Navy and Aviation, which competed with each other. The regional Gauleiter organized their own supply networks outside the central directives. The result was a structural inefficiency that contrasted brutally with the image of orderly and disciplined power. The distribution of the benefits of growth was also profoundly unequal. Private consumption by German households in 1935 was still 7% lower than in 1928, before the Great Depression. Private investment was 22% below its 1928 levels. The increase in industrial production went almost entirely to the arms sector. The average German in 1938 ate less meat and butter than in 1928, lived in a smaller dwelling, dressed poorly, and had less access to durable consumer goods than before the crisis. The economic miracle was real for steel industrialists, aircraft manufacturers, and army suppliers. For the average worker, it was a promise constantly deferred. The public debt was astronomical and completely unsustainable. The Mefo-Wechsels would win. The invoices for imports for the 4-year plan were piling up. Frozen wages and pent-up inflation created pressure that price controls could not maintain indefinitely. The regime's economists calculated that without a military victory that would bring massive foreign resources, raw materials, foreign exchange, forced labor from the conquered countries, the German economic system would collapse within 3 to 4 years. Hitler knew it. He had said it explicitly in the secret memorandum of August 1936. The solution to Germany's economic problem was conquest, not as a consequence of economic policy, as its fundamental objective. On the 8th of May 1945, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeburg and General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional capitulation of Germany in Reims. The Reich that had promised to last 1,000 years was extinguished at 12. German cities were ruins. Dresden bombed in February 1945 by 1,300 Allied aircraft, burned for 3 days. Hamburg, the target of Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, had lost 42,600 civilians in a week of firebombing. Berlin, the scene of the last fighting, was a field of rubble in which barely a third of the buildings were still standing. Volkswagen's factory in Wolfsburg, built as the pride of Nazi industrialization, had received Allied bombs that destroyed most of its facilities. The German gross national product had fallen by 1945 to about 20% of the 1938 level. The currency, the Reichsmark, was worthless paper. Citizens survived by bartering. The Allied occupiers distributed food rations of about 1,500 calories a day, enough to survive, insufficient to work. Historian Richard Overy estimated that between 1939 and 1945, Germany lost approximately 7.4 million military and civilian deaths. What was left of the miracle? The German industrial fabric, although damaged, was in many ways more modern in 1945 than in 1938, because the bombing raids had destroyed obsolete facilities that were later rebuilt with new equipment. The technical and skilled workforce continued to exist. The educational and scientific base remained, although deprived of the generations lost on the fronts and of the Jewish emigrants who did not return. On these material bases, With the American Marshall Plan, with access to Western markets, and with the political stability provided by the new Federal Republic, Germany would build in the 50s the Wirtschaftswunder, the real economic miracle, based on competitive exports, productive investment, and growing consumption. The real German miracle of the 20th century was not the weaponry of the 1930s, it was the reconstruction of the 50s. But that's another story. It ends here, among the rubble of what the war machine promised and could not sustain. Not because it was weak, but because its own contradictions made it unsustainable. The Nazi economy was brilliant on the surface, hollow in the core.